So now we have f of x equals x minus 3 and g of x equals x squared. Now work ahead of me a little bit. Don't look at the board, but just tell me, we want to find f of g of x and g of f of x. That's what we're trying to do. So see if you can do that. Now, hopefully you paused and wrote down what you think it might be. Here's the way I want you to write this down. First of all, f of g of x equals what? We ignore anything we know about g of x and we replace x by g of x as it's been replaced here, so that x minus 3, when you replace x by g of x, becomes g of x minus 3. In other words, f of x is x minus 3, so f of aardvark is aardvark minus 3, and f of g of x is g of x minus 3. We don't confuse any of that with the fact that g of x is x squared. We ignore that. We write down this step. Now there's something else I've written down here. We'll come back to that. Just a substitution. Now we have f of g of x is the square root of g of x minus 3. Now we know that g of x is x squared, so we replace g of x by x squared, and we get f of g of x equals g of x minus 3 equals x squared minus 3. We write out all three steps. Okay? And then we do g of f of x. Okay? We ignore what f of x is. We don't care. G of f of x, since g of x is x squared, g of f of x has to be f of x squared. If g of x is x squared, g of aardvark is aardvark squared, so g of f of x is f of x squared. So that's what we write down. Don't pay any attention to f of x. We just write down the symbols for f of x. Then we look at f of x and we say, okay, it's the square root of x minus 3, so we're going to square the square root of x minus 3. We're going to replace f of x here with the square root of x minus 3, because it's, of course, equal to that, and we can replace a quantity with a quantity it's equal to, so there it is. Now, of course, we can square that, and we get x minus 3. Now, there's a little question about domain here, so we'll come back to that. So, ignore this stuff for the moment. Just, look at this part here, okay? Without the stuff off to the right. We'll talk about that in a minute. And to emphasize this, we said, okay, to get g of f of x, what do we do? Well, g of aardvark is aardvark squared, because g of x is x squared. G of 5, well, if x is 5, then we get 5 squared. G of x plus h, we've got to have x plus h here, x plus h squared. G of negative 2, okay? X is now negative 2, so x squared is the square of negative 2. And remember, we write this down as that quantity negative 2 squared because we're squaring whatever x is, and what x is negative 2. We don't write down negative 2 squared because the square only applies to the 2, not to the negative sign, unless we have the parentheses. That would be negative 4. That's not what we want. That's not what g of negative 2 would be. So be careful about the parentheses. Okay? Now another example, just a substitution. And we'll come back again in a minute and think about domains. Okay, f of x is x squared, and g of x is square root of x. So, we got the definitions of f of x and g of x. We write out f of g of x, ignoring anything we know about g of x. We don't care about that square root. Literally, the literal substitution is if f of x is x squared, then to get f of g of x, we replace x by g of x. So we replace this x by g of x, and we get g of x squared. We don't worry about the algebra. We don't worry about what g of x is. We just write this down. And if we have g of f of x, we don't worry about what f of x is. It doesn't matter. G of f of x, well, g of x is square root of x. So if we replace x by f of x, we're going to get the square root of f of x. That's it. That's all we have at this point. Now, we will think about what g of x is, and that's the square root of x. So we replace g of x with square root of x, and we get the square root of x quantity squared. And of course that equals x, and there's a thing about the domain, so don't worry about it right now. And then g of f of x is the square root of f of x, as we established a minute ago. And f of x is x squared, so this is the square root of x squared. And what's the square root of x squared? Well, I said it's x. And that's actually not exactly right. It's the absolute value of x. So I'll address the reason for that in a minute. There's no restriction. Okay, no restriction. That's what I'm going to address in a minute. Okay, so hopefully we understand the substitution that's involved in doing an f of g of x or a g of f of x.